Welcome back with a smiling face. Links to previous episodes are given in the video description, so don't forget to like, subscribe and share the video. Echoes of Shattered Destiny. Episode 11. Chapter 82-90. Maddox had set to work the moment he returned from Brittany's cell. Luna Freya had managed to free Brittany and KL the guards. Upon further investigation, one of the patrol teams on the western side of his territory had been KD. We could only assume Luna Freya had been working with the vampires and used them to free Brittany. Without Tyler, we hadn't a clue why Brittany was valuable to the vampires, and I was reluctant to visit Tristan and ask him myself. Maddox and Zeke left the house shortly after searching the dungeons, taking their betas with them. The rest of Maddox's men had arrived and needed proper housing and food. Bran had also left due to the arrival of his men. The few warriors Luna Freya brought with her were confused by her absence, and repulsed at how their Luna had betrayed the pack. Brianna wasn't answering my calls, not that I expected her to. While I was still uneasy about Giovanni, I knew he would never hurt her. I resisted the urge to call Mason, though I hadn't heard from him since the vampires had attacked the pack. Even my grandma, dad, and Sean were busy. For the first time in a long time, I felt utterly bored. I savored the free time I had, relishing in the peacefulness. Sometime during the afternoon, Brianna had finally called. After reassuring me everything with her and Giovanni was fine, she asked if I would sleep over tonight. Brianna picked me up from the pack house around 7 at night. The stress and weariness had left her shoulders, leaving a light glow across her skin. Her eyes had a sparkle within them, twinkling with happiness when she thought I wasn't looking. "How's everything with Giovanni?" I asked, noticing the smile that tugged at her lips when I said his name. "He's struggling. He's leaving behind his family, but he understands the choice he made." Brianna sighed. Alpha Maddox stopped by today and questioned him. He seemed to believe Giovanni. Maddox stopped by. I frowned. I hadn't seen or heard from him all day. Only for a couple minutes. Brianna shook her head. "Is it bad that I'm happy? I feel horrible for Giovanni, and I understand what he lost, but I'm still really happy. I don't think that's a bad thing." I frowned. "I just hope other vampires see things his way. We don't want to eradicate them the way they do us. Giovanni never wanted any part of that." Brianna frowned. "He was raised to obey the king above anyone else, his opinions never mattered." "Well, they do now." I nodded, giving her a reassuring grin. We spent the night in her bedroom as we had countless times in the past. She told me about Giovanni, and how she would meet with him at her aunt's house. I could see the guilt burning in her eyes, but I couldn't seem to muster any blame. I knew I would have done the same. She couldn't seem to stay away, but she hadn't betrayed the pack by giving him information. I promised her I wouldn't tell Maddox, a promise I was happy to keep. Her pastel pink walls remained the same, even though she had begged her mom for months to repaint the room. Over the years, her twin-sized bed had been switched out for a larger one, along with a sofa against the far wall. Her room hadn't changed much from when we used to be friends. "I hear you're spending the night away from me." Maddox's deep voice coiled into my mind. "Who told you?" I asked, shooting a suspicious look at Brianna. "Brianna." Maddox chuckled, his laugh deep and rich. "Whatever will I do without you hogging my bed?" "I don't hog the bed." I scoffed. "You're the one that likes to cuddle all night. You sleep." Maddox chuckled. "Can you blame me for wanting to stay close? I sleep because you refuse to let me sleep in clothes." I rolled my eyes, though a blush had already begun forming on my face. Clothes are restricting. Maddox snickered, I'm afraid I'll miss you tonight. The mighty Alpha Maddox can handle a night to himself. I cooed, chuckling as his low growl reverberated through the mind link. After all, you left me alone all day today. I had business to attend to. Maddox sighed, and my heart fluttered as a strong pang of longing flowed through the mind link. Does that business have anything to do with why my entire family seemed to be busy? I smirked. It is your birthday tomorrow. Maddox chuckled. I don't need a party or anything like that. I sighed, though a smile had worked its way onto my face. I have enough to worry about tomorrow. In the midst of all this we all need some downtime. I could feel Maddox's smirk through the mind link, you most of all. I suppose it wasn't a horrible idea. I chuckled, my face turning red at the thought of Maddox organizing a party for my birthday. Good night, Lola. Maddox purred, I'll be thinking of you tonight. Brianna eyed me suspiciously as I ended the mind link, the corners of her lips turning up in a smirk as she registered the heat on my face. I'm guessing you talked to Alpha Maddox. Brianna snickered. Don't pretend you didn't have the same look on your face when we were talking about Giovanni. I teased. The two of us stayed up late, talking as we used to. Maddox was right, we needed some fun in the midst of all this drama. We couldn't let take laughter and love from us. I curled up on Brianna's couch, a mountain of blankets covering me to replace Maddox's incredible body heat. Sleeping without him left me feeling cold, but I reminded myself it was only for one night. As I slipped into darkness, a feeling of unease settled in my stomach. The pink walls around me faded, replaced with smooth stone. The carpeted floors evaporated, turning into smooth tile. Where her desk had once sat, a roaring fireplace resided. Tristan stood from the couch he sat on, a breathtaking smile on his face as we locked eyes. I was positive I hadn't brought myself here, and wondered if he were able to call me against my will. Hello, beautiful. Tristan grinned, happy birthday, Lola. My eyes flickered to the clock on his wall, looking strangely out of place against the velvet maroon furniture. Tristan was right, it was my birthday. The clock on his wall read 3 in the morning. What am I doing here? I grimaced, I didn't bring myself here. For once, I called on you. Tristan smirked, it's not every day the future vampire queen finds her mate. You're not my mate. I scoffed, relief flooding my veins at the absence of a mate bond between Tristan and I. You are half vampire, Lola. Tristan smiled slyly, his ocean eyes seemed to capture the light from the fire, making them flicker with heat. His voice turned uncomfortably soft as he began to approach me. You are more like me than you think. Tell me, beautiful, did you enjoy the taste of that vampire's blood? Did it make you feel powerful? Heat flooded to my face but disgust did not follow. He was right. The vampire's blood healed the wound in my stomach, but also filled me with a sense of power. The blood swelled my muscles, and sharpened my senses. The taste was alluring and rich like dark chocolate, and as hard as I tried, I couldn't bring myself to feel disgusted. You don't have to say anything, beautiful. Tristan murmured, coming to a stop just a few inches away from me. His hand grazed across my jaw, but I was rooted in place. The trail his hand made across my face was warm, similar to how drinking blood made me feel. So beautiful, so perfect. Tristan purred, all lingering in his tone. As I looked from the corner of my eye, I noticed him watching me. I am asking you to choose me, Lola. I know what you want, what you need. I would give you the world. My chest constricted at his words, and I tried desperately to force myself away. The mark on my neck burned with need, and it took all of my willpower to remain rooted in place. I could taste the sincerity of his words on my tongue, I could feel his fondness for me grazing over my skin. I don't want that. I managed to force the words from my lips, though they lacked conviction. What a beautiful queen you will make. Tristan murmured, his fingers running down a lock of my raven hair. Something in his words called to me, making my blood sing. Queen, I would be queen. The power was in my blood, waiting for me to accept my role and step into power. You feel it, don't you? Tristan murmured, his eyes soft as I fumbled for the words to say. The power is right there, Lola. All you have to do is reach out and take it. An image full of blood and DTH flashed through my mind. Maddox's cold corpse lying on the ground, his blood watering the earth. Brianna and Giovanni, sprawled out in the middle of a battlefield, their fingers intertwined as they met at DTH's doors. Sean, Dad, Grandma, Mason, Zeke, Bran. All of them scattered across a battlefield, the grass a brilliant shade of scarlet. Birds circling up ahead, lured by the smell of blood and DTH. Buildings burned and reduced to rubble, shards of glass littered along sidewalks and deserted roads. The packhouse bright with flames, crackling as the heat devoured every trace. A once beautiful town reduced to rubble, the earth stained with the blood of thousands. A crown of gold and rubies sitting upon my head, Tristan at my side. My father, the man who had used and discarded my mom, smiling at me from the throne I sat on. Countless vampires at my beck and call. So much power, and so much DTH. I wanted none of it. No, my voice came out in a breathless rasp as I stumbled away from Tristan. No. I don't want this. I don't want to be queen. I will not help eradicate werewolves. Why kill off an entire species when you can rule them all? Tristan's voice grew quiet, his eyes intense as they roamed my HR-struck face. I would never ask that of you, Lola. But the Vampire King has his own agenda, and I have mine. Tristan murmured quietly, his eyes flickering to the thick oak door that separated his room from the rest of the building. His words were sincere, but laced with a danger I did not want to face. You must listen closely, Lola, as I will only say this once. Your father wishes for the complete destruction of werewolves. Without werewolves, we will be free to enslave humans. Becoming queen won't change that. I hissed, but the fire in my voice had long been extinguished. I'll fight with my pack until this mess is over. It will never be over, Lola. Tristan's words were dark, his tone heavy. If you think for 1 minute your father does not have a backup plan, then you are a fool. I know you well enough to tell you are no fool. If you do not accept the throne, you will sorely regret it. What is that supposed to mean? I hissed, jumping as footsteps echoed outside of Tristan's door. His eyes were wide as they turned on me, his voice held desperation. I am not as evil as you make me out to be, Lola. Choose me and I can help you. There are some vampires who agree with me, who do not wish for the destruction of your kind. What is his backup plan? I pleaded, but the room around me had already begun to fade, leaving behind a heavy sense of foreboding I couldn't seem to shake. Chapter 83. The conversation I had with Tristan replayed in my head until a headache whispered at my temples. What did he mean? How did the Vampire King have a backup plan? Was there some way I could refuse the throne, and why would I sorely regret it? My inner monologue was cut short by the sound of Brianna waking up. The two of us headed down to her kitchen where we cooked a huge breakfast. As her mom and dad were particularly useless in the kitchen, they sat on the sidelines with steaming cups of coffee in their hands. Brianna hadn't worked up the nerve to tell her parents she found her mate, let alone tell them he was a vampire. They both had asked a couple questions about Brianna's mystery mate, but quickly dropped the subject. Once we finished with breakfast, Brianna insisted on sorting through her closet to find me the perfect outfit for this afternoon. I wondered what lengths Maddox had gone to for my birthday celebration and how large the party would actually be. Brianna wouldn't let a single detail slip, claiming I could use a positive surprise after all that's happened. She managed to find me a little black dress, the sleeves hung low and exposed my shoulders. It was a far cry from other dress Brianna had given me, the one I had suffered a stab wound in. This dress was longer, much more appropriate for a birthday party. Brianna managed to keep me thoroughly distracted until late in the afternoon. She had applied a thin layer of makeup to my face, using black eyeshadow around my eyes. After a generous helping of concealer and loose powder to the scarlet mark on my shoulder, it was successfully covered up. Though I could no longer see the mark, I could still feel the weight of it on my skin. She also curled my raven hair into large ringlets, brushing them out so they framed my face perfectly. My pleas at leaving the house had gone unnoticed. She had denied my idea of visiting Giovanni, knowing I would use the opportunity to sneak a peek at what Maddox and my family had been up to. We were both worried about the future, and how the pack might react to Giovanni. If Maddox is my mate, their Luna will be a half-breed. I shrugged, though it didn't ease the worry in my gut. Maybe Giovanni and I should just leave. Brianna frowned, concealing the pain burning in her eyes. No, I shook my head, my voice hard. I'm not letting anyone drive you away. If Giovanni is truly on our side, he's part of this pack. Anyone who has a problem with that can come to me. I wasn't ready to voice what Tristan had told me, that he was in fact on our side. Tristan's loyalty came with conditions, but he was willing to stand against my father. Most in the pack would follow Maddox's word as law, but there would be some who retaliate. People like Alpha Bran had a long-standing vendetta against the vampires and would never accept them into their lives. If I were to become Luna, would I be able to do what must be done? Those who rise against Maddox would have to be snuffed out. I couldn't expect Maddox to react to treason with mercy. We left the house around 6 in the afternoon. Brianna promised to stay at the party for as long as she could, but had to leave to bring Giovanni some blood. Maddox allowed Brianna to take blood from the pack hospital, so long as it was nearing its expiration date. Maddox had been respectful when questioning Giovanni, even though he still didn't trust him. Confusion was written on my face as we approached the pack house. The large yard spanning the front of the house looked exactly the same. The flower beds along the porch had been tended to, the bright gardenias and poppy flowers were swaying in the afternoon breeze. As we got out of the car, I was battered by 100 different scents. Upbeat music trickled through the open windows of the pack house, the breeze carried the scent of roasted chicken, sugary icing, and various barbecued foods. If I listened hard enough, I could hear the faint chatter and laughter of people. Brianna led me through the pack house with a grin on her face, placing her hands over my eyes at the last minute. With an amused scoff, I let her lead me through the house. She slid the back door open, my nose and ears showed me what my eyes couldn't. The chattering had died down as the door opened, replaced by hushed whispers. Now that I was closer, I could make out the scent of each food. My stomach rumbled in response as Brianna removed her hands. The large garden behind the pack house had been completely renovated. It was clear how I hadn't noticed it from my window, as the party strayed from that side of the house. The sun was slowly lowering in the sky, casting buttery light across the plush clouds. Twinkling lights had been woven through the rose bushes and over the canopy of trees. Various fountains sat around the garden with stone benches circling each one. A couple large grills were scattered about, my dad manning one of them. Grilled meat was piled onto large platters and placed onto long buffet-style tables. Although it wasn't dark outside, lit torches lined the garden. The party wasn't refined or proper, making it absolutely perfect. Something strange swelled inside my gut as I looked on at the crowd of people who had come to the party. Most came for the celebration, needing a bit of happiness in the midst of all this but Maddox and my family had planned this entire party for me. I blinked back the tears that pricked my eyes and grinned at the crowd of people. "Happy birthday, Lola!" Brianna grinned, glancing at the plates of steaming food. "Where's Maddox?" I couldn't help but ask. I was practically shaking at the thought of seeing him, at the thought of finding my mate. For a moment, sympathy flashed in Brianna's eyes and my stomach dropped. "He'll be here." Brianna smiled softly, understanding the anxiety boiling in my gut. "He's stationing the rest of his and Alpha Brand's men around the borders. We don't want any surprises tonight. Come and enjoy the party, I know you're D*G to eat as much as I am." I traveled down the porch steps with Brianna, heading over to the grill my dad was cooking on. His eyes crinkled as he saw me, pulling me into a hug before I could say anything more. "Your mom would be so proud of you, Lola." Dad grumbled, wiping away the tears that formed in my eyes. "You might have not come from me, but I watched you grow and learn. I was there when you first shifted and nearly took Sean's head off. You'll always be my daughter. And you'll always be my dad." I chuckled a little breathlessly. I breathed in his familiar scent as it mixed with the smell of grilled food. No matter who my father was, I already had a dad. The man who raised me could be replaced by no other. I grabbed a piece of grilled chicken from the large plate my dad had, giving him a cheeky grin as I plucked the piece in my mouth. "Hey, Lola!" Sean shouted, maneuvering through the crowd to greet me. "Happy birthday! There's someone here who wants to talk to you." I turned from my dad with a wave and followed Sean. For a moment, my heart was hammering in my chest. I assumed it were Maddox who wanted to speak with me, but my excitement quickly turned sour as I caught Mason's gaze. He was seated at one of the stone benches, watching the water trickle from one of the many fountains. This particular fountain was wide-rimmed with a voluptuous woman standing in the center. Water poured from her open hands, her face a mask of serenity and peace. Mason had seen better days, but seemed to be putting on a brave face. His eyes were bright but ringed with darkness. His usual lopsided smile was missing, replaced with one of uncertainty. Sean clapped a hand on his shoulder, giving him a reassuring smile that held a certain familiarity. "It seems Sean took our advice." Maya murmured, "Hopefully they help each other cope with everything." Sean left the two of us alone, and I shifted uncomfortably on my feet. The upbeat music seemed out of place with Mason's solemn face. I half expected him to yell at me, to tell me how it was my fault Adrian had died. Instead of yelling, an exhausted sigh left his lips. He mustered up a half-hearted smile and waved me forward. I sat beside him gingerly, keeping my eyes on the fountain before us. "Happy birthday, Lola!" Mason smiled, his voice held a hint of the friendliness he felt before. A shard of guilt pierced my skin as I looked into his eyes and saw the loneliness within them. "Thanks, Mason." I breathed with uncertainty. "I forgive you, you know." Mason frowned, running a hand through his tangled hair. The haunted look on his face nearly brought me to tears. "I know it wasn't your fault. It never would have worked between us, I know that now. I can't explain how sorry I am, Mason. I frowned, fighting to keep my voice strong. I'm sorry for everything. I know you are. Mason sighed, wrapping his arm around my shoulders. I leaned into his touch with a small smile. I hoped everything would be okay, and that Mason might find some semblance of happiness in his life. We sat in silence, watching the water fall from the porcelain woman's hands. Her eyes were closed, an intimate smile on her face. I couldn't help but notice the similarities between the stone woman and Adrian. Both were curvy with angular faces and full lips. The only difference was the statue had a look of peace on its face, while Adrian had a look of disdain. I fell for you, Lola. I fell hard. Mason's voice held such confusion and sadness that my heart lurched in response. An amused chuckle left Mason's lips at the look of shock on my face. A sliver of his lopsided smile had returned as his fingers brushed against my reddening cheek. I had never thought of Mason in that way, and felt guilty for that fact. Maddox had always been on my mind, followed by brief thoughts of Tristan. I never just let me finish. Mason smiled softly, halting my words. I know you don't feel the same, and I'm not asking you to choose me. My mom was abused by her dad. Even when he was old and frail, she was still so afraid. I think I fell for you because of how fearless you are. You've never been afraid of the things thrown at you, you face them head on. I hope you find your mate, Lola. You deserve a happy ending. After fighting the urge to convulse into tears, Mason shooed me away. He wiped the tears from my eyes and told me to enjoy my birthday. My heart felt heavy and light at the same time, both free and horrifically weighed down. I cleared my mind, determined to enjoy this sliver of heaven while it existed. I danced with Brianna until my limbs ached, and ate until my stomach groaned. A head of black and silver hair pulled me from the dance floor and I stepped into my grandma's arms. Even with a million different scents in the air, I could point out grandma's lavender scent effortlessly. Her dress matched the delicate pink of the rose bushes, making her look much younger. The dress flowed over her curves in a sea of pink silk. Even though I wasn't related to her by blood, my soul recognized her own. The love in her eyes was mirrored in my own, as was the beaming smile. The worry that plagued her eyes was gone for the moment, replaced with fondness and excitement. Happy birthday, my beautiful granddaughter. Grandma grinned, pulling me into her arms. I wanted to give you some time with your friends before pestering you. You could never pester me, Grandma. I laughed, leaning into her embrace. Your dad would say otherwise. Grandma scoffed. Alpha Maddox and your dad seemed to be under the impression I worked too hard. They refused to let me lift a finger while they set all of this up. Maddox wouldn't let you help. I snickered, giving Grandma an innocent smile. Wouldn't even let me bake the cake. Grandma scoffed. Men. Can you believe it? You mean I have to endure this entire night without any of your pastries? I gasped in HR. The HR wasn't entirely forced, as Grandma's pastries were addicting. Of course not. Grandma snickered, looking like a devious teenager. Since when did I let a man tell me what to do? You'll find a few containers in my car. Did you make your lavender brownies? I questioned, my eyes flickering over to my dad. Dad seemed oblivious to our conversation and was enjoying his job at grilling all of the food. It had been too long since Dad had gotten out of the house. Of course, and enough coconut macaroons to last you the weekend. Grandma chuckled. Now, tell me what's been bothering you. Bothering me? I asked with a frown. You can't hide the troubled look in your eyes from me. Grandma shook her head, even your dad hasn't mastered that art. Better to get it off your chest so you can continue enjoying your birthday. I visited Tristan last night, the vampire that marked me. I sighed, letting Grandma lead me away from prying ears and over to one of the fountains. He brought me this time. He was trying to warn me, Grandma. Little lights sat at the bottom of the fountain, making it look as though the water were glowing. This fountain had 3 tiers, spewing water from each level. Warn you. Grandma frowned, the troubled expression on her face matched my own. Do you believe this vampire cares for you? I think he does, in his own strange way. The feeling isn't mutual. I sighed, something he said worried me. He said the Vampire King has a backup plan in case I reject the throne. He said I'd sorely regret it. How could my father have a backup plan? The only backup plan I could think of is having another daughter. Vampires can only reproduce with their marked mates, and I'm positive your mom never had another child. Grandma grimaced, shaking off a bad memory. This Tristan could have been lying to you, perhaps to force you into taking the throne. Do you believe he was being sincere? All I know is, this is the first time he hadn't tried to make a move on me. I shook my head, trying to sort through the hurricane of emotion I was feeling. He looked genuinely concerned. He even told me he wasn't on my father's side, that he doesn't want to get rid of all the werewolves. I think it would be best if you proceed with caution. Do not take Tristan's word as truth, but I wouldn't dismiss him quite yet. Grandma nodded, looking oddly serene. If what he says is true, he could prove to be a valuable ally. His loyalty comes with a price. He wants me. I grimaced. It seems Tristan is playing a dangerous game. Regardless, if he truly cares for you, your happiness is paramount. Grandma shrugged, but gave me a reassuring smile. I'm much too old for these kinds of things, but I'll help you in any way I can. You'll never be old to me, Grandma. I grinned, feeling as though a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. Grandma led me back to the party, demanding I set aside my worries for tomorrow. While the issue of Tristan and his questionable loyalty had been set aside, I had another concern pressing at the edges of my mind. Where was Maddox? I hadn't seen him during the party, and hadn't heard from him through the mind link. The few times I attempted to contact him, I came up short. While alphas had the power to block a mind link, it worried me that he had chosen to do so. Other than the delicious scent of charred meats, I hadn't smelled anything intoxicating and alluring. Maya was still on the lookout for our mate, though Maddox had been at the forefront of our mind. After quite some time, Brianna managed to catch back up with me. The sun had long ago sank behind the clouds, leaving behind a deep indigo sky. The twinkling lights looked like fireflies resting in the trees and rose bushes, making the entire garden look like a magical oasis. Leaving already? I asked, noticing the dreamy look in Brianna's eyes. I'm sure Giovanni is starving by now. Brianna chuckled, the pink tinging her cheeks was noticeable by the torch light. He won't hunt for anyone, but I don't want him to suffer. No worries, I believe you. I chuckled, though the thought of Giovanni hunting a human made me equally uncomfortable and hungry. This is for you. It isn't much, but I know you've never been one for expensive gifts. Brianna teased, handing me a small box wrapped in silver paper. I'm sure it's perfect. Thank you so much. I smiled softly, tell Giovanni I said hi. You have to stop by sometime. He's really amazing. I think you two would get along quite well. Brianna grinned merrily, and I couldn't help but return the smile. I'll stop by tomorrow. I replied, waving as she headed back into the pack house. "Happy birthday, Lola!" Maddox's rough voice murmured through my mind. Irritation formed at the edges of my heart, though my stomach fluttered excitedly at the sound of his voice. "And where have you been?" I grimaced. "You spend all this time setting up a party and have the nerve to not show up. Let me make it up to you." Maddox purred, his warm voice coiling around my agitated heart. "Look towards the forest line, Lola. Do you see the blue lights?" I scanned the forest line as Maddox suggested, noticing a thin string of cobalt lights wrapped around the trunk of a tree. "I see them." I nodded. "Good, follow them," Maddox murmured, his voice thick. "Come to me, Lola." My legs moved on their own, and before I knew it, I found myself in front of the thick oak tree. Using the string of thin lights as a guide, I let them lead me deeper into the forest. The brush around me was dark, but I had little trouble navigating through the dense forest. It seemed as though a path had been cleared for me, the ground leveled so I would have little trouble walking in the dark. Further up ahead, I could make out a warm light. Little bits of orange light twinkled in the trees, cascading down the branches in a sea of white and orange. The emerald leaves stood out against the light, making the forest look completely different at night. 20 feet away, at the edge of a little clearing, stood Maddox. Dressed in a black suit, he looked incredibly beautiful but completely out of place. His devastatingly handsome face was serene, but even from the distance, I could see the worry gleaming in his eyes. The orange and white light gave his honey eyes more depth and seemed to draw out the golden hues within them. From where I was standing, I couldn't grasp his scent. As the anticipation and worry began to build within me, I stepped forward. A thin sweat broke out over my skin, and my heart hammered mercilessly. I couldn't help but notice how my dress matched Maddox's suit perfectly, as though Brianna's clothing choice had been intentional. As I stood 10 feet away from him, the air around us seemed to shift. A gentle breeze whipped past Maddox, ruffling the hair on his head. All at once, his scent swirled around me, battering me senseless. Rich and earthy, sweet and musky, both dark and alluring. His scent was a beacon drawing me forward, awakening parts of me that had been sleeping for so long. The shock and joy in his eyes mirrored my own as the mate bond snapped together with an audible click. My legs moved on their own accord, propelling me forward until I slammed into his hard chest. The golden hue in his eyes had been replaced by endless darkness and longing. "Mate!" Maddox murmured in awe, his voice soft and fragile. Maddox had always been a strong alpha, willing to do what needed to be done. I hadn't realized he had fears and hopes of his own. I never thought this moment lingered in his mind as much as it did my own. The dazzling light danced off our skin, reflecting in our eyes. The word left his lips like a song, full of longing, relief, and excitement. "Mate!" I repeated, Maya's voice blending into my own. A weight had been lifted from my shoulders, one I had never noticed. The weight of my potential mate had been pressing down on me, suffocating me into exhaustion. A dazzling smile formed on Maddox's face, one that left me weak and enthralled. My heart fluttered at the sight, realizing he had reserved that smile specifically for me. The smile lit up his face, and I wondered if I had ever seen another person so full of joy. My hands crawled up to his face, and a smile of my own formed as sparks ran the length of my skin. Dad had told me countless times what it would feel like when I found my mate, but words seemed to fall short in comparison to this moment. Everything other than Maddox and I seemed to fade away, the importance of everything else drifting away. I knew what I was fighting for, who I was fighting for. I knew it, I knew it. Maddox laughed lightly, though his eyes were blown wide with wonder. I've never loved someone like this. I've never loved someone so completely. You love me? I breathed, shocked at the sound of my own voice. I had never heard myself so full of happiness before, so carefree of the dangers that lie ahead. I do. Maddox smiled, flashing his dazzling teeth. I have for so long. While I had experienced his embrace countless times, this felt entirely different. My soul soared to meet his own, blending into something new yet familiar. Our light touch wasn't enough, and yet it was everything I would ever need. Why didn't you say anything? I asked, my voice coming out in a breathless laugh. I needed to know you were mine first, that you weren't meant for someone else. The pain in his voice broke something within me and I clamored to erase the flash of pain in his eyes. I'm yours. I always have been. I smiled softly, the stubble on his jaw tickling the pads of my fingers. As I am yours, Lola. Maddox murmured, his face lowering to meet my own. His lips had been nothing like what I expected, as they held more emotion and passion than I ever could have anticipated. His lips were soft against my own, but held the pain and worry we both had been feeling for weeks now. My fingers tangled in his silky hair as our lips meshed together, our pain and passion melting into one. Every ounce of stress or anxiety I had been feeling melted away under his gentle touch. Maddox had relinquished control, allowing me to part his lips with my tongue. I was drowning in his scent, in the blissful sparks that consumed my entire being. I could feel a piece of him burning within me, marking me as his equal, as his Luna. Any past experience had not prepared us for this moment. Even after every touch and caress, our bodies were completely unprepared for one another. Our lips moved together slowly, savoring every taste and sensation blasting through our bodies. It took every ounce of strength within me not to leap on him, as I had forgotten our surroundings completely. Maya was a love-struck mess, willing to seal the deal out here in the open. I want you to mark me, Lola. Maddox murmured, smiling slyly at the look of shock on my face. I've waited far too long to claim you as my own. If it weren't for our surroundings, I would complete the mating process right now. The passion in his words left me speechless, fumbling for some semblance of control. Instead of waiting for an answer, Maddox held me against him and looked deep into my eyes. Mark me, mate. He purred, let me mark you in return. My lips knew what to do on their own, finding the softest piece of flesh to sink my teeth into. The scent wafting off his skin left me dizzy. A low growl rumbled in his chest as I dragged my canines along his neck before sinking them into his soft flesh. Maddox remained still as I lapped the blood from his skin, smiling softly at the wound I created on his neck. Somehow, I knew once it healed, it would be sapphire in color. Neither of us felt the need to speak, as our eyes communicated what needed to be said. I tilted my head to the side, unable to stifle the whimper that left my lips under his touch. You're so beautiful. Maddox purred against my skin, his tongue flicking over my neck slowly. His canines were cold against my skin, yet they heated me. Pain melted with pleasure as his teeth pricked my skin, drawing blood that trickled down my collarbones. Alpha, we have a problem. Luna Freya's men have invaded the pack. The blonde vampire is leading them. They barreled through our defenses on the northern perimeter and are heading south. Brianna and Giovanni. My voice came out in a breathless rasp, fear settling into my bones. Any kindness I had felt for Tristan vanished, leaving me wondering why he had come in the first place. I knew the blonde vampire was Tristan, just as I knew he was spearheading this entire AK. His false promises left a bitter taste in my mouth. Maddox sprung into action, planting a hasty yet passionate kiss to my lips before speaking. I know you want to come, but stay here, Lola. Maddox breathed, fear burning in his eyes that I hadn't seen before. Go find your dad. I'll take care of this. I gave him a weak nod, the same fear burning in my own eyes. I knew Maddox could handle himself, yet I couldn't fathom a world without my mate, a lifetime without Maddox. I couldn't imagine how Mason and Sean survived, as the thought of losing Maddox was enough to bring me to my knees. I watched on in silence as Maddox shifted and bounded off into the forest, taking a part of my soul with him. A new weight pressed on my shoulders as unspoken words dripped from my lips. Covered under layers of concealer, the scarlet mark on my shoulder remained untouched and intact. Chapter 84. As Alpha Maddox bounded through the forest, he sent out an alert to everyone in the pack. I could feel the panic ripple and spread, but Maddox managed to contain the wildfire before it consumed us all. Attention everyone, those of you on the northern side of the pack, seek shelter. Remain indoors until further notice. The rest of you, head south and find a safe place to lay low. I had no intention of letting Maddox handle the invasion alone, as I'm sure he had suspected. Now that I had finally discovered my intended mate, the last thing I wanted was to let him out of my sight. First, I needed to make sure my family was safe. I didn't run when I found out the truth about my heritage, nor did I run when I found out Sean was taken, and I refused to run now. Staying in human form, I bounded through the woods and headed back to the party. The twinkling lights that had once been romantic, were now beacons leading me back to my family. The smell of grilled food still lingered in the air, though the laughter and dancing had ceased. The music had gone silent, as had the carefree atmosphere. Tension rippled along the crowd as many held their children close, piling into cars and driving down the road. Most chose to leave, heading to their homes where they believed themselves to be safe. Children continued running around, oblivious to the heavy sense of foreboding. The adults knew the truth. If Maddox, Zeke, and Brand's men failed to stop the AK, none of us would be safe. My dad had abandoned his station at the grill, helping some of the elderly into the pack house. I gave Dad a hand as we lifted an old woman's wheelchair onto the porch. Dad placed the woman into her chair and wheeled her inside with a grim nod. Grandma was helping some of the parents track down their excited children, those too young to understand what was happening. Sean and Mason were nowhere to be found, most likely heading towards the northern perimeter. I wanted to scold Sean for placing himself in danger, but how could I blame him when I intended to do the same thing? Once everyone had cleared out, I headed inside with my grandma. There were only a handful of people who chose to remain in the pack house, all of them chattering quietly about the oncoming threat. Grandma flitted around the room like a hurricane, offering food and water to anyone in need of it. Dad perched himself in one of the recliners, looking more troubled than usual. Sean and Mason head over to the northern perimeter? I asked, catching the sour look on my dad's face. Sure did. He huffed, can't stay out of trouble any better than you can. I guess it runs in the family. I snickered half-heartedly. You make sure your brother's safe while you're there. Dad grunted, his eyes narrowing as he looked at the mark on my neck. I suppose Alpha Maddox finally got around to marking you, huh? Can't say I'm disappointed, always knew you were destined for great things. You'll be the most stubborn Luna in history. I'll be stubborn, but I'll get things done. I chuckled, my face heated under his knowing gaze. How'd you know Maddox was my mate? Blame your grandma. Dad grumbled, she's suspected ever since you started training. Of course, she did. I scoffed, meeting my grandma's amused gaze. I have to take care of something before I leave, but I'll make sure Sean's safe. I ran up the stairs, heading to the bedroom Maddox and I shared. This had been a last resort, but I needed information. The scarlet mark on my shoulder tingled under the layers of concealer, reminding me that it hadn't faded away under Maddox's touch. As the bedroom door closed behind me, I reached out with my mind. Calling the shadows had become easy, as though they were hidden in the dark, waiting for my call. I walked over to Maddox's bedside table, grabbing the crude dagger I knew he had stashed there. The air around me turned cold, followed by the teeth-chattering chill that sank into my bones. From the deepest corners of the room, the shadows squirmed, answering my call. I pressed the jagged blade against the palm of my hand, exerting the slightest amount of pressure. The stinging pain was numbed from the cold, and I watched as my blood pooled in my hand. I couldn't help but notice Tristan's mark was the same shade, the color of fresh blood. I need information, I told the shadows, watching them writhe at the sound of my voice. The slivers of smoke and shadow glided towards me, wrapping around my legs like an affectionate dog. Ask, princess. Let us drink. They whispered, their voices like icy silk against my cheek. Why hasn't Tristan's mark faded from my skin? I kept my voice low in fear of being overheard. I was just marked by my mate, but the vampire's mark is still on my skin. Half vampire, half werewolf. They whispered, their silky voices sent a chill down my spine. A mate for each side. One by fate, one by choice. I didn't choose Tristan. I hissed, watching as the shadows coiled around my legs. A part of you is drawn to the vampire. They purred, the part of you that longs for blood. I want his mark gone from my skin. I grimaced, what is your price? A bond for a bond. They replied, our price is the bond you hold with Alpha Maddox Desmond. No, I murmured, wincing at the stab of pain that coursed through my body. Maddox was the mate I wanted, the person I had chosen and was made for. Giving up the mate bond between Maddox and I meant destroying a part of my soul, destroying a part of his soul. I don't accept. I could taste the shadow's disappointment on my tongue, sharp and cold like a shard of ice. I willed the shadows away from me, willed them to return to whatever depths they emerged from. One by one, they slithered into the darkest corners of the room. The shadows writhing against the walls became still, making the cold dissipate. The shadows were wrong, they had to be. I murmured to Maya, who unleashed her outrage at the information I had just received. I don't want Tristan, and I certainly don't choose him. I know. Maya sighed, I know how you feel for Maddox, but I can't tell how you feel about Tristan. There's a whole side of you that I don't have access to. Tristan's attractive and can be seductive when he wants, but he doesn't call to my soul. He doesn't make me feel like I had been sleeping my entire life, only to finally wake up under his touch. He doesn't make me feel a fraction of what Maddox does. And yet there's a bloodthirsty side of you that he calls to. Maya frowned, whatever happens, don't throw away what we have with Maddox. I won't. I shook my head, I promise you that. I ran back downstairs, giving my dad and grandma a quick hug before darting out the door. I grabbed a set of car keys from the table in the foyer, unlocking one of the many cars Maddox owned. Only a few minutes had passed since I talked to the shadows, and I hoped I wasn't too late. Taking your sweet time coming up here, Lola. Maddox's voice flooded through my mind. Am I that predictable? I snorted, putting the car in reverse and peeling off down the road. Predictable is not a word I would use to describe you, darling. Maddox purred, somehow managing to sound seductive despite the fact that he was fighting against our own kind. Sean is safe, by the way. Mason's at his side. I'll be there in a couple minutes. I promised, we're mates, you can't get rid of me that easily. Which car are you taking? Maddox asked, making me chuckle. Even with the situation at hand, he cared about his car. I grabbed the first key I came in contact with. I shrugged, it's a Mercedes, if that helps. Good, it's Zeke's car. Maddox snorted. I ended the mind link as Maddox came into view. He had shifted into his wolf, a large black beast that plowed through vampire and werewolf alike. Even with his large size, he moved with incredible speed and accuracy. Blood coated some of the other wolves' coats, yet none ceased their fighting. It seemed the Vampire King had deployed very little of his men on this AK, and used Luna Freya's remaining men as the brunt force of the AK. The houses had become scarce on this side of town, as most people lived towards the center. My heart stammered in my chest as the house Giovanni was staying in came into view. An inconspicuous house of blue panels and an old white porch. Brianna's car was parked outside, rested against the curb. I parked Zeke's car on the side of the road, watching as one of the many wolves fighting slammed into Brianna's car. The door of the car dented effortlessly under the weight of the wolf, the window shattering upon impact. Brianna's going to be pissed. Maya muttered. Pissed but alive. I commented. Maddox and the rest of his men seemed to have the fight under control. I stayed on the outskirts of the fight, inching my way towards the house. As I made it to the porch, my stomach dropped. The door had been kicked down, lying in pieces on the living room floor. I made it inside just in time for one of the wolves to slam into the porch, destroying a quarter of it. The boards groaned and screamed as they snapped, but the wolf seemed mostly unharmed. With the snapping and snarling of wolves outside, the inside of the house was heartbreakingly quiet. Brianna! I shouted, running up the stairs and peeking my head into the two small bedrooms. A king-sized bed sat in one of the rooms, the blankets a mess as though someone had been sleeping in it. Brianna's scent was all over the house, the strongest portion on the large bed. Her scent was mixed with another, something earthy with a hint of sweetness. I knew the smell would be Giovanni's, but the scent in the bedroom was already beginning to fade. As I stumbled back down the stairs, I noticed something shiny on the floor, reflecting the dim light in the kitchen. I headed through the kitchen to the sliding glass doors that gave a perfect view of the forest. The glass had been shattered, tiny droplets of blood stained some of the pieces. An icy chill rushed through me, though this time it wasn't from the presence of shadows. A note was pinned against the wall, held in place by an ornate silver dagger. I had seen this dagger before, when Tristan and Giovanni fought to the DTH. We want the half-breed. Make a wrong move, the traitor will D*E. You have 48 hours. Chapter 85. The first thing I did was try to mind-link Brianna. I was hit with a wall of darkness, of nothing. Even as I stumbled through the dark, I knew they had placed silver on some part of her body. Mind-linking her would be impossible until the silver was removed. Brianna had given her wolf form to save Giovanni, but her wolf still resided within her, simply trapped in her human body. Enhanced speed and strength she would retain, as well as her connection to the pack. My nerves felt horribly fried, but panicking would do me no good. I needed to stay calm for Brianna's sake, and come up with a plan to save their lives. Once the fight had ended, Maddox came inside the house. I watched as his entire frame went rigid with anger. Not only did they want me in return for Brianna and Giovanni's lives, but they had come here with the purpose of taking Giovanni. I knew it was a low blow for Maddox, as Brianna was a part of his pack, and he was tasked with protecting us all. I sent a gentle soothing wave down the mate bond between us, watching as some of the tension faded from his shoulders. Maddox had lost little men during this fight. Luna Freya's men were not so lucky. The bodies of both wolf and man were scattered about, and Brianna's car was beyond destroyed. I figured that was the Vampire King's intention, to use Luna Freya's men in replacement of his own. After all, what was more wolves to the Vampire King? Maddox gathered a group of men and began dragging some of the fallen into the woods. We pulled the bodies of our own men behind a building, keeping them out of sight. Their families would need to mourn properly, and a large FL would be held for them. I helped the guys drag the bodies into the forest, though I could only manage one at a time. Each of us wore a grim expression on our face, all thinking the same thing. The Vampire King had done nothing but toy with us for weeks now, and had taken little action to throw this pack into disarray. We still had little information on the Vampire King, and hadn't a clue where he might set up base. I had seen the stone bedroom in my short visits with Tristan, but couldn't glean enough information to name a specific place. Their headquarters had to be close enough for immediate action, but far enough away to remain safe and inconspicuous. A plan was beginning to take root in my mind, though I needed to think the entire thing through. The war between vampires and werewolves was inevitable, but this pack had been taunted enough. Alpha Maddox had brought in nearly 1,000 of his men from across his vast territory. Many housed with other families and filled all the nearby hotels. Bran and Zeke's men were in the same situation, taking what shelter they could find, or accepting the tents Maddox had given them. Food had been provided at the large community center in town, courtesy of the influx of volunteers we received. Maddox had resumed training 2 weeks ago, expanding the size of his class by another 100 students. Anyone willing and able to fight would have a place in this war. Maddox split the training up into smaller groups, assigning some of his men to the task. I was surprised at the influx of volunteers, young men and women willing to risk their lives for this pack. Despite Maddox's cruel reputation, he was willing to give everything for this pack. I could tell by the look in his eyes, that Maddox would give his life before forcing any of his people to fight. It was a side of him I had never knew existed, a side that changed the way I viewed him. A couple days ago, I had talked over evacuation plans with Alpha Maddox. His territory was vast, but the vampires were targeting the center of our town. Many of the citizens could head to the opposite end of Maddox's territory, nearly 4 hours away. Others could escape into the nearby city, finding shelter until the war was finished. What we needed was inside information. We needed a heads up on when this war was happening. Without it, we were all good. I was once the type of person to jump into a situation without thinking. While I'm still stubborn and headstrong, I had learned my lesson. As insane as my plan was, I had thought the entire thing through. There was no other option for this pack. My sense of self-preservation and my duties as Luna were at war, but they had not changed my decision. The smell of burning bodies lingered in the forest, the dark smoke spewing into the sky, covered by the darkness of night. The breeze was blowing in the opposite direction, a gift from nature that the people in this pack would not have to endure the stench of DH. Maddox's men made quick work of cleaning the blood from the streets, houses, and cars. Exhaustion had long ago settled in my bones as countless hours had passed. My feet ached from the flats Brianna had given me, and the dress I wore was speckled in dirt and ash. I smelled like a walking corpse, and promised myself a long shower once we were finished. I visibly jumped as Maddox placed a hand on my shoulder, the comforting sparks licking over my skin. "Let's head back, let the rest of the men finish cleaning up." Maddox spoke lowly, his eyes still dark and troubled. Maddox led me down the road to where I had parked Zeke's Mercedes. The car had somehow remained untouched, not a scratch on the shiny paint. Good, Zeke will be happy to hear his car survived. Maddox chuckled dryly, slipping in the driver's seat. Maddox had thrown on a pair of loose sweatpants after returning to his human form. While it was hard to take my eyes from his rippling muscles and creamy skin, the two of us had other things on our mind. I'm sure Maddox already assumed I was coming up with a plan, and had no intention of letting Brianna or Giovanni d*E for me. Instead of demanding answers from me, we drove home in a comfortable silence. Attention everyone! It is safe to return to your houses. The threat has been neutralized. Maddox sent a quick message through the mind link, informing everyone in town that it was now safe to return home. My birthday had quickly gone downhill, though I had no one to blame but my father. I still considered it a blessing that Maddox was my mate, even with the problem of Tristan's stubborn mark. When we arrived at the pack house, Dad had taken most of the elderly home in his truck. Grandma had already baked up a storm in the kitchen and was putting her cookies and brownies into Tupperware containers. They each had their own ways of coping with stress. Despite Dad's injured knee, he insisted on being hands-on. Grandma liked to bake enough pastries for the entire country. The smell of Grandma's pastries filled the house, and I couldn't help but meander into the kitchen. Tupperware containers were stacked by the dozen, and I watched as Grandma wiped down the counters with a rag, humming softly to herself. A relieved grin formed on her face as she caught my eye, pulling me into a hug that soothed some of the unease in my stomach. "How's Sean and Mason doing?" she asked. "They're all right, just helping the others clean up." I sighed, giving her a tired smile. "It seems we weren't the only ones busy," Maddox commented, stepping into the kitchen. A soft smile had formed on his face as he looked at my grandma, one that made me want to ask about his family. Grandma gave Maddox a gentle nod, a bright smile forming on her face. "Welcome to the family, Alpha." Grandma chuckled, "I'm afraid I've raided your kitchen. Would you mind passing some of those out to some families tomorrow?" Maddox asked, eyeing the dozens of Tupperware containers. "Save a few for us, of course. Lola didn't save me any the last time." Grandma's eyes brightened at Maddox's words, and I snickered as she shot me a knowing look. She had always judged someone's character on whether or not they liked her cooking, and so far, Maddox was passing. "Of course, I will." Grandma nodded happily. By the time Dad had brought all of the elderly home, Sean and Mason had returned to the house. The four of them piled into Dad's truck, and headed home. I was practically swaying on my feet, and didn't argue as Maddox led us upstairs. "You smell like DH." Maddox chuckled dryly, picking up a strand of my hair and breathing deeply. His face contorted in a grimace, making me roll my eyes and smack his shoulder. "You don't smell so wonderful yourself, mate." I smirked, making a show of sniffing him and nearly gagging. "Keep taunting me and neither of us will get any sleep tonight," Maddox muttered, though a rare smile had formed on his face. The two of us hopped in the shower, and I used my remaining energy to scrub the scent of DH from my skin. The steaming water released some of the tension from my body, but my mind was clouded with worry. There was no way Maddox would agree with my plan, but it was our last resort. The Vampire King would grow tired of taunting us, and we needed information before that happened. Maddox's eyes narrowed as he noticed Tristan's mark still lingering on my skin. The wound Maddox had left on my neck was healing, revealing a cobalt blue mark beneath the scab. "His mark is still there," Maddox growled lowly, tracing his finger over it with a dark grimace. I asked the shadows. "They said I have a mate for each side." I frowned. I asked them to remove it, but the price was too much. "What did they ask?" They wanted our mate bond. I spoke softly, tracing my finger over the wound I had left on Maddox's blemish-free skin. I couldn't part with what I feel for you. Not in a million years. And what about this vampire? Maddox snarled, what do you feel for him? I looked into his eyes, holding his dark stare. I let the truth ring through the mate bond, soothing his aching heart. I feel nothing for him, Maddox. Nothing compared to the way I feel for you. Maddox scooped me into his arms, placing a fierce kiss against my lips. There was little restraint as our lips collided, my back slapping against the tiled wall. Desperation, love, and jealousy flashed within the kiss, and I devoured each emotion as the sparks lapped my skin. We only pulled away once our lungs were devoid of oxygen, our lips sore and bruised. My mind was still reeling as we slipped into bed, the silk blankets grazing my skin softly. Maddox pulled me into his arms, and I inhaled the clean scent of him. All man, mixed with spices and earth. The sparks that ran across my skin lulled me, making my eyelids heavy. Tell me about your family. I found myself asking, my voice a sleepy mumble. I hardly know anything about them. My mom's name is Claire, my dad is Killian. They had a rough start as mates, but it worked out in the end. I have an annoying little brother, Brandon, and a couple cousins. Maddox's voice was gentle, his hand tracing circles along my spine. What else would you like to know? Where are they now? I asked, my words somewhat slurring together. How did they have a rough start? I sent them away when all of this began. My mom, dad, brother, aunt, uncle, and cousins are all someplace safe. Maddox replied, as for my mom, she dealt with some things when she was younger, things that came back to haunt her. Dad wasn't so understanding at first, but eventually he came around. They sound really nice. My voice came out soft. Anything else Maddox had said fell on deaf ears, as I had already drifted off to sleep. I woke to an empty bed, holding the pillow Maddox had been sleeping on. His side of the bed was still warm, letting me know he hadn't been up for long. I threw on a pair of sweatpants and a t-shirt, and headed down to the kitchen. Maddox smirked as I walked through the door, one of my grandma's cookies in hand. Cookies for breakfast? I asked, an eyebrow raised. I made myself a cup of coffee and drank deeply, letting the warmth seep through my body. Maddox snorted at my comment and took another bite. Can you blame me? You and Zeke ate everything last time. I never thought lavender cookies would be this good. Never underestimate Grandma's baking. I shook my head, grabbing a cookie for myself. She'll have you on the ground if she hears you doubted her incredible skills. Just as I have no doubt, she could defeat me. Maddox chuckled. His carefree attitude was short-lived as last night's events came to mind. Maddox knew I was coming up with a plan of my own, that I wouldn't allow Brianna and Giovanni to suffer. Care to tell me your plan concerning Brianna and Giovanni? I watched you mull over it for hours last night. The kitchen was the last place I wanted to have this conversation, but Bran, Zeke, and Maddox's beta were all still asleep. It was better to get it off my chest now, as I was unwilling to negotiate. I'm going to turn myself in. I nodded, stilling the turmoil in my gut. At first, Maya was completely against the idea. She hated the thought of being unable to reach me, the thought of me being in danger. As the hours passed, she had come to agree. We had no information regarding where Brianna and Giovanni were being kept, and we hadn't the time to send spies out into the world. No, Maddox stated, simply put. His face contorted into a grimace, one that made my heart ache. They'll kill you, Lola. Have you thought any of this through? You know I have, and I don't think they'll kill me. I'm the Vampire King's only daughter, he needs me to take the throne. My mom's DD, so he can't have any more children. I said, taking a deep breath before launching into the details of my plan. I'm going to turn myself in and gather as much information as I can about where their headquarters are. We know nothing about the vampires, Maddox. We don't know where they sleep or where they come from. When this war happens, we'll be blind. We can't afford to let them have the advantage. And what about your heat? Maddox asked, his voice growing darker with each word. That was one of the downsides of this plan, that my heat would quickly be approaching. I had around a week, perhaps 2, until my heat hit with full force and I'd be willing to mate with anyone. A she-wolf's heat didn't start until after she was marked, a way to speed up the mating process. I'll have to get my information before that happens. I grimaced, knowing how bad this plan sounded. I have 2 weeks at the most, but I'll get it done in a week. I won't be anywhere near them when my heat hits. I'll find a way to mind link you, then you and a group of men can come and meet me at the entrance to wherever the vampires go during the day. Maddox remained silent, clearly at a loss for words. He hadn't expected me to think this through so thoroughly, but he knew I was right. We needed this information at all costs. It could be the tipping point of this entire war. And what if they place silver on you? You won't be able to contact me. I can't let that happen. I won't let you sacrifice yourself for this pack. Maddox shook his head, his lips set in a grim line. Tell me you wouldn't do the same. I pressed, tell me you wouldn't risk everything for this pack's safety. I'll figure out a way around the silver, I'll send the shadows to tell you if I must, but I need to do this. Maddox closed the distance between us, taking my face in his hands. His grip on my face was gentle, as were his lips when they met my own. It was nothing like last night's kiss. The kiss was one of boiling, consuming fear. I could taste the terror on his lips at the thought of losing me. His tongue grazed along my lower lip, slowly begging for entrance. Just as I allowed him access, he pulled away, leaning his head against my own. Don't you dare on me, Lola. Maddox murmured, those honey-colored eyes burning into my own. My stomach fluttered unhappily at the thought of leaving Maddox, but we needed this information. There wasn't much I wouldn't do to return to Maddox and this life I had built for myself. I won't, I promise. I murmured softly, running my hands over the rough stubble that coated his jaw. I'll always find my way back to you. You better. I'm not sure I'll be able to let you go. Maddox breathed, giving me an empty chuckle. It's because you love me that you'll let me go. I smiled softly. In that case, you're spending the day with me. Maddox smirked, but the action didn't reach his eyes. Maddox walked me through what he had to do in a day, and I wondered how he managed it all. As soon as Bran and Zeke woke up, a whirlwind of problems, questions, and requests surfaced. The influx of warriors in the town required large amounts of food, and loads of volunteers to cook the food. Maddox appointed a few of his men, some I had seen around town before, to oversee finding more volunteers. Some of the men were unhappy with their living quarters, to which Maddox tried his best with new accommodations. Next came the repairs to the northern part of town. You'd be surprised at the damage that occurs when a large werewolf is thrown into a building or car. Those unlucky enough to live on that end of town were in dire need of new cars, as it was too long of a distance to walk. Maddox used money from his personal fund to replace their cars and fix any damages to the house and land. Maddox had listened to every request, no matter how small, and treated them with the utmost importance. He had also planned small gatherings within the pack to boost morale. The constant attacks were weighing on everyone, and Maddox was determined to provide an outlet for the frustration. He also began preparations for funerals of the lost werewolves in our pack, and gave large financial settlements to the families. As each of the DD were named, Maddox's eyes seemed to dim. I could tell he took every DH personally, every life lost was another chip on his shoulder. We had finally gotten time to ourselves late in the afternoon, long after the sun had sunk into the sky. Maddox sat at the chair in his office, a hand combing through his dark hair. I could now see why his hair was always so messy. A scowl had been etched onto his face as he stared down at a stack of papers. My gut twisted at the sight of him. A man with countless rumors talked about him, a man feared, and yet his loyalty to his pack was unbreakable. Chapter 86. You need a break. I frowned, standing from my chair across the room. I approached Maddox, turning his chair away from the desk, from the stack of papers begging for his attention. Reluctantly, his eyes turned on me, dark and pleading. Don't go. Maddox sighed, wrapping his arms around my waist and burying his face in the crook of my neck. I wouldn't if I had a choice. I spoke softly, combing my fingers through his soft hair. I'm doing this for the pack. I'll KL my way out of that building to get back to you, I promise. You're too good for me, you know that. Maddox murmured against my neck, his hot breath fanning over my skin. I pulled myself away from Maddox and looked into his eyes, staring into their honey-colored depths. I could see how much he believed in what he had said, that I was too good for someone like him. He's wrong. Maya murmured quietly, he thinks he needs to do everything by himself, that he doesn't deserve help. You're wrong. I shook my head, letting my fingers trail over his stubble. We're perfect for each other, that's why we're mates. You need someone willing to sacrifice just as much as you for the good of this pack. You don't have to handle this stuff alone anymore, let me help where I can. And right now, I'm helping you by making you take a DN break. Come take a bath with me. Maya's silent approval on my suggestion was enough to push me forward. She wanted to remain as close to Maddox as possible before I turned myself in. She was still uncomfortable with the thought of being suppressed by Silver, but knew we were out of options on the matter. Maddox's lips turned up in a smirk, though his eyes were blown wide with emotion. Giving him a half-hearted scoff, I tugged at him until he stood, leading him far from his office and into our bedroom. The bathroom had proven to be my favorite room in the house, with a large walk-in shower and a large 4-person tub. I had used the jets on the shower walls more times than I could count, letting the hot water pour down my aching muscles. I turned the faucet on and watched as the tub slowly began to fill with water. Maddox cocked his head in my direction, a lopsided grin on his face as he tugged at the hem of my t-shirt. He slipped it from me in one fluid motion, letting it fall to the floor in a pool of cotton. Even after marking each other, the weight of his gaze was enough to make blood rush my face. As always, Maddox noticed every response my body made under his attention, and appreciated each and every one. Even after all this time, you still blush when I have you undress for me. Maddox smirked, a chuckle rumbling deep in his chest. It's not my fault I have some decency. I snickered, looking him up and down. Maddox had let his own shirt fall to the floor, but still wore his low-hanging jeans. Decency. Maddox snorted, his smirk going wider. Last I remember, I caught you swimming in your bra and panties. You caught us because you were lurking. Maya snickered, though there was no malice in her tone. No one else knew about the swimming hole. I shook my head, unable to avert my eyes as his pants slid to the floor. Muscles encompassed most of his body, running down his arms and stomach in hard waves. His broad shoulders only made his build look larger, and me that much smaller in comparison. I'm still not sure how you knew about it. I patrolled the forest around this town extensively before attacking. Maddox smirked, reminding me of a time when Tyler had been alive. Tyler had long ago pissed Maddox off, disrespecting him and his pack. I found the swimming hole easily. When I saw you walk into the woods, I knew exactly where you had gone. And yet, you felt the need to follow. Maya's purr wrapped around my mind, and I received a very detailed mental image on how she hoped this bath would end. Maddox tugged at the hem of my sweatpants, and smirked as they fell to the floor. With another gentle tug, my underwear had fallen around my ankles. I sank into the tub with a happy sigh. The hot water seemed to wipe some of the stress away. While my plan had officially been set in motion, tomorrow was the day I turned myself in. I could feel Maddox's hand wrap around my submerged ankle, tugging it until I slid across the tub and into his arms. His sly smirk made me roll my eyes, though something else had grabbed my attention. The wound I had left on his neck was fully healed, revealing a beautiful mark. Cobalt blue in color, a crescent-shaped moon with two small stars stood out on his skin. The mark was unique, as it was for all mated wolves. The color was not flat, but seemed to shimmer and deepen, reminding me of the night sky. Your mark is healed. I smiled softly, taking in the full image of Maddox. His large build leaned against the tub, the water lapping at the muscles on his stomach, the cobalt mark standing out against his creamy skin. Strands of his hair had gotten wet, and clung to his forehead. He looked like a fallen angel, carrying the weight of this pack on his shoulders, somehow managing to withstand it all. It's the exact opposite of Tristan's. Maya pointed out. She was right, where Tristan's was the color of fresh blood, Maddox's was the color of the midnight sky, set with hues of black and indigo. Both were striking in appearance, but symbolized different things. His eyes were soft as they roamed my face, reading the awe in my gaze as I took in his form. Maddox grabbed a bar of soap and moved to turn me around. I rooted myself in place and shook my head, grabbing the bar of soap from his hand. You've washed me how many times now? I asked. It's your turn, now turn around. A lazy smile formed on his handsome face, and instead of turning around, he grabbed my hips and placed me over his lap. Maddox leaned back in the tub, exposing his muscular chest and arms. Half of his stomach was out of the water, and I traced the lines of his abs with my eyes. Start with the front, darling. Maddox grinned, making me roll my eyes, though a blush had already crept onto my face. Alpha. I scoffed, poking my tongue out at him. I ran the bar of soap across his chest, unable to keep my fingers from wandering the planes of his muscles. His chest rumbled under my touch, and I watched as his eyes darkened. The sparks were gentle, growing in intensity as I continued running the soap over him. I trailed from his chest over to his arms, working the soap into a lather, before moving down to his stomach. Surprise flashed in my eyes as something hard hit against my backside, and the soap had fallen from my hand, hitting the bottom of the tub with a dull thud. Maddox's lips were on mine seconds later, both of us burning with urgency. A day, a week, a month. It was too much time to go without him, to not know my fate. I wanted something for myself, something before I finally fell into the clutches of my father. I had been willing to give it all to Maddox in the past, and that hadn't changed since receiving his mark. I let my fingers tangle in his hair, tugging his face closer to my own, his lips further into mine. His tongue darted in my mouth, softly seeking my own. His hands lit my skin on fire as they grasped my waist, and together we burned. For once, Maddox didn't protest as my hands wandered down his chest, over his stomach. Neither one of us would be able to stop once we started, and neither of us had the strength to put an end to this. I was immediately thankful my mom had placed me on birth control as soon as Tyler and I started dating, never knowing I would make use of it with a different alpha, my mate. I will never tire of this of you. He purred softly, his hands tangling in my hair. His chest rose and fell in time with my own, our eyes burning with need, desire, and so much more. I had once thought the mate bond forced love onto you, but I now knew I was wrong. The mate bond intensified what was already there, the passion and love between two people. Where Maddox had once refused to let me touch him, he made no action to stop me. You're mine, I murmured, running my fingers over him, committing the smell, taste, and sight of him to memory. My mate, who carried such a heavy weight on his shoulders, determined to it all so that his pack might thrive. My beautiful mate. He moaned lowly in my ear. My name left his lips as he came. Our bodies trembled against each other, our lips still moving in sync. The room grew silent, our panting breaths the only sound. His eyes were bright, like molten honey, staring down at me in awe. The mating bond was like a thick cord between us, joining us in more than just physical. We spent the next few hours lying in each other's arms, unable to pull our hands away. Maddox's eyes were glazed as he traced patterns along my shoulders, spine, and bottom. Settling into his arms, I fell into a blissful sleep, the soreness between my legs a happy reminder of our night. I had woken sometime in the middle of the night to Maddox's lips grazing my jaw, his teeth nipping at my skin. Somewhat groggy, I opened my eyes and smirked at the innocent expression on his face. Couldn't sleep? I asked in amusement. From his small kisses alone, my body had already begun responding to the touch. Can you blame me? He murmured against my jaw, you look like a goddess and beautiful. I'm afraid my self-control is entirely spent. His words were enough to ignite a fire burning in my belly. Chapter 87. Maddox's POV. The moment I saw the note the vampires had left, I knew a plan would form in Lola's mind. I wanted to blame her, but I couldn't, as I would have done the same. I would have given myself up to save any member of my pack, but Lola was different. The selfish side of me wanted to whisk her away, Brianna and Giovanni's life in the process. Yet I couldn't, because Lola would never forgive me. I watched the gears turn in her head as we cleaned up the mess from the fight. She intended on turning herself in, that much was clear. My wolf and I were at odds. He wanted us to take Lola far away from this pack, away from the Vampire King, while I knew we needed to respect her decision, even if it might tear my mate away from me. Sean, Mason, and some of my other men scooped up the corpses and brought them deep into the woods. The easiest way to dispose of the bodies were to them. I wouldn't allow them to be buried, to curse my land with their presence. They would be burned, their ashes cast far away from my pack. The vampires had toyed with my pack countless times, and the war was finally coming to a head. I had made preparations weeks ago in case we suffered another AK, all we needed was information. Thousands of men had been brought in, from my pack, Zeke's, and Brand's. Evacuation plans had been made, ensuring the safety of all those who couldn't fight. Countless volunteers had stepped up to fight in this upcoming war, and each new volunteer brought on a new wave of pain. These people, my people, were willing to give their lives for their home. I wanted to spare everyone, to fight this war on my own. Just as Lola wants to willingly walk into the enemy's arms. My wolf grumbled, you two are not so different. She's taking on the position of Luna without ever knowing it. Save Lola, save the people of this pack. I wanted to do it all, and yet, I knew it was impossible. I knew lives would be lost on both ends, but I continued wondering if there was something more I could do. Once the streets were cleaned up, and the blood gone from the earth, I took Lola back to the pack house. Once her dad and grandma left, I led her upstairs, watching as she wobbled on her feet. I noticed everything about Lola, the way her eyes would flutter shut when she got tired, or the way blush would stain her cheeks as she slept at night. She had me wrapped around her finger long before her birthday, probably since the moment I had met her. "You smell like DH." I chuckled, a fluttering sensation in my chest as she blushed and rolled her eyes. "You don't smell so wonderful yourself, mate." She smirked, making a show of smelling me, her small nose scrunching up. If only she knew what she did to me, she might never let me live it down. Every expression that crossed her face left me in a perpetual state of awe. I'd watch as her plush lips turned up in a smirk, and a sly glint cross her eyes. If it weren't for all of the drama going on, I would have long ago locked her in my bedroom and finished the mating process. Every smirk, every touch was beginning to drive me mad. This was how the mate bond worked. It would drive us closer and closer, until the process was complete. The jealousy, the frenzy wouldn't end until her first heat had subsided. It was in the shower that I noticed Tristan's mark still on her skin. The wretched vampire had marked her against her will, and decided he had some false claim over her. The one thing I refused to take away was Lola's choice. She often acted and spoke before thinking, but I would never take that away from her. Tristan declared himself her mate long ago, confident though he had been utterly mistaken. His mark is still there. I grimaced, unable to keep the growl from escaping my lips. I traced over the vulgar mark, wishing I had been there that night. I asked the shadows. They said I have a mate for each side. Lola frowned, looking truly torn. Her sadness evaporated some of my anger, as I was now distracted with the urge to remove her frown from her face. I asked them to remove it, but the price was too much. I wondered what the shadows had asked for. Was it another life? Did they want someone else to D*E to wipe the mark from her neck? I would gladly kill 1,000 vampires to pay that debt. What did they ask? They wanted our mate bond. Her voice was soft, though my stomach dropped. I could hear the fragility of her voice, how she desperately wanted his mark removed, and yet she absolutely refused. She would rather remain connected to that vampire than destroy the bond between us. I knew it was ridiculous, that there was no need to ask. I could see how Lola felt about me every time her eyes met my own, but I needed to hear her say the words. "And what about this vampire?" My voice emerged in a guttural snarl. "What do you feel for him?" Her words had worked their charm, calming my wolf like a sedative. "I feel nothing for him, Maddox. Nothing compared to the way I feel for you." The sincerity in her words made my control slip, and I found her in my arms, my lips against her own. Lola hadn't been my first kiss, but she had been the first to ignite so much emotion within me. I had been loved, and loved in return, but I had never been in love. So desperately in love that I was willing to sacrifice everything I cared for, everything I worked for, just to keep her safe. The emotion was raging and uncontrollable, but I couldn't fight it even if I tried. We pulled away for oxygen, a useless necessity that tore her from my arms. We slipped into bed, every inch of her milky skin on display. Not that she would admit this, but I knew she enjoyed sleeping as much as I did. I had caught her eyes roaming me when she thought I wasn't looking, and enjoyed every ounce of attention I received from her. As devious as she acted, her innocence shone clear in her eyes. Her face always gave her away, blush filling her cheeks anytime I caught her gaze straying downward. With her in my arms, all of the stress cleared from my mind. Her delicate scent of vanilla and pears calmed me, wiped all worries from my mind. Her soft breaths fanned across my chest, her body molded perfectly into my own. "Tell me about your family," she asked, surprising me yet again. I smiled as I heard the sleep mixing into her words. She wouldn't stay awake much longer, that I was sure of. Lola was always quick to fall asleep, and could be a nightmare when you woke her up. In the mornings, her hackles would raise and her bright eyes would narrow at anyone who dare woke her up. It was another thing I had quickly come to love, something that made Lola that much more beautiful and adorable in my mind. My mom's name is Claire, my dad is Killian. They had a rough start as mates, but it worked out in the end. I have an annoying little brother, Brandon, and a couple cousins. I told her, giving her the shortened version as she was quickly on the verge of sleep. What else would you like to know? My mom, Claire, had hated the idea of finding her mate. My dad had been an AE at first, but quickly fell under the pull of the mate bond. It took a truly awful person to abuse their mate, to treat them badly. Though my dad held the same cruel reputation as I, he had never harmed my mom. Sometimes I could see parts of my mom in Lola. The sheer strength, the courage to risk it all. They were both so alike, and yet so very different. "Where are they now?" she asked, her silky words slurred sleepily, and I smiled as she yawned loudly. "How did they have a rough start? I sent them away when all of this began. My mom, dad, brother, aunt, uncle, and cousins are all someplace safe," I assured her. As for my mom, she dealt with some things when she was younger, things that came back to haunt her. Dad wasn't so understanding at first, but eventually he came around. I didn't mention the specific details, hoping Lola might ask her when they finally met. I had heard the story of my mom and dad meeting countless times, how he had tried to force the bond between them, and mom retaliated. Dad told me she had bit him a number of times, something I could easily see Lola doing. When I was old enough to understand, I asked my mom what happened to her all those years ago. Even with a rough start, and ghosts from the past, mom and dad had made it work. "They sound really nice," Lola cooed, the sound making my heart flutter. Anything else she planned to say fizzled out as a quiet snore left her lips. I chuckled at her soft snores, running my finger along the blush on her cheeks. With Lola in my arms, sleep had come easily, pulling me into its endless depths. I had woken up before Lola, a usual occurrence as she somehow could manage to sleep half the day away. After the long night we had, I figured I'd let her sleep for another hour or so. I headed down to the kitchen, grabbing a bottle of water and a Tupperware container of Lola's grandma's cookies. Lola had a strange addiction to anything her grandma baked, and could eat her cookies by the dozen. Her and Zeke had easily gone through 4 containers. Their stomach ache lasted for hours, though they both deserved it. "Cookies for breakfast?" Lola asked, her eyebrow raised as they strolled into the kitchen. I watched in silence as she made herself a cup of coffee, noting how her jeans hugged her full hips perfectly. Her round bottom was on display, and though it wasn't her intention, she was teasing me mercilessly. I had half a mind to skip work today and carry her to the bedroom. Instead of acting on my impulses, I snorted at her comment. "Can you blame me? You and Zeke ate everything last time. I never thought lavender cookies would be this good." My own mom had been absolutely horrible in the kitchen, though her skills improved over the years, her cookies were nothing like this. Never underestimate grandma's baking. She shook her head, her raven hair fanning out from the motion. She'll have you on the ground if she hears you doubted her incredible skills. Just as I have no doubt, she could defeat me. I chuckled, though the feeling of comfort was short-lived. I'm going to turn myself in. Lola spoke up, her plush lips pressed tightly together. She had never been one to procrastinate, and I knew this conversation was coming. I had watched her plan formulate in her mind for hours last night, and knew she would eventually act on it. No, I replied, my wolf speaking the word for me. He was desperate to keep her at our side, and was willing to lock her away if need be. I was constantly fighting him for control, to give Lola the chance to make her own decisions. They'll kill you, Lola. Have you thought this through? I already knew she thought this through, as I had watched her mull over the plan for hours. Her face would contort in determination, just to fall in sadness. I knew she worked through every possible variable, though this plan was far from safe. You know I have, and I don't think they'll kill me. I'm the Vampire King's only daughter, he needs me to take the throne. My mom's DD, so he can't have any more children. She said, taking a deep breath before continuing. I'm going to turn myself in and gather as much information as I can about where their headquarters are. We know nothing about the vampires, Maddox. We don't know where they sleep or where they come from. When this war happens, we'll be blind. We can't afford to let them have the advantage. She was right, horribly so. We needed this information, any information to give us a head start. It would take time to evacuate the people in this town, to get the elderly, pregnant, sick, and children far away from the battlegrounds. The vampires would tear them to shreds without a second thought, uncaring if they were unable to defend themselves. I had spoken with Giovanni yesterday, and hated myself immensely for not asking the location of their headquarters. I had been too hell-bent on understanding Tristan and Lola's father. Giovanni told me all he knew, that Tristan's infatuation with Lola had to do with her place on the throne. He wanted to stand by her side, to rise to power along with her. Lola's father wanted her for the same reason. As his sole heir, she was the only one able to take the throne. The Kuritis bloodline couldn't be allowed to end, the power of controlling the shadows vanishing completely. And what about your heat? I asked, my voice dark. Too much could go wrong if Lola were to go into heat around the vampires. They wouldn't be affected the way a werewolf would, but I knew none would dare refuse her advances, especially Tristan. She would throw herself at any male, desperate to end the fire burning beneath her skin. Lola wouldn't be to blame in the situation, but it was a risk I desperately did not want to take. I'll have to get my information before that happens. Lola grimaced, and I knew that this was one of the downfalls of her plan. She had thought over this fact, but couldn't come up with a solution. Once you had marked each other, there was no stopping your heat. I'll have 2 weeks at the most, but I'll get it done in a week. I won't be anywhere near them when my heat hits. I'll find a way to mind link you, then you and a group of men can come and meet me at the entrance to wherever the vampires go during the day. I remained silent, mulling over her plan myself. If everything were to go perfectly, we could have the upper hand in this war. We would know where the vampires hide during the day, and hopefully gain information on when they plan to attack. It would be a fool's mission to bring the war to their turf, but if we knew the timeline of their plans, we would have a better chance at winning. And what if they place Silver on you? You won't be able to contact me. I can't let that happen. I won't let you sacrifice yourself for this pack. I shook my head, my chest constricting painfully at the thought of handing Lola over to our enemies. Any number of things could happen to her, and I wasn't sure I'd survive in a world without her. Tell me you wouldn't do the same. She pressed, her eyes bleeding with desperation. "Tell me you wouldn't risk everything for this pack's safety." "I'll figure out a way around the silver, I'll send the shadows to tell you if I must, but I need to do this." She was right, and we both knew it. I closed the distance between us, determined to keep her close, to claim every inch of her before she left, before our future became uncertain. Our kiss wasn't hasty, it wasn't burning with unbridled passion. This kiss was one of longing, one of an unspoken future where I woke up beside Lola each day. A future where we grew old, where we had a lifetime to decide, to have children, to love each other. The kiss was one of fear, one that showed just how terrified I was of losing her. I had survived on my own for so long, living in the dark until I became accustomed to it. Lola was my light, and I had been blinded by her for so long. Now that my eyes had finally adjusted, I couldn't go back to living in the dark, to living without her. As our lips melted together, our worries, hopes and fears mingling, I schemed my tongue along her soft lip. Just as her lips parted, I pulled away. Her breath fanned across my face, sweet like coffee creamer. My heart hammered in my chest, and I stifled the fear that threatened to explode within me. "Don't you dare on me, Lola!" I whispered, my forehead against her own. Her bright eyes were wide, but brimming with emotion. She didn't want to go through with this plan, and I knew her wolf was having the same selfish thoughts as my own. We could run, that had always been an option. To leave all of these innocent people to fend for themselves, hoping the vampires would follow us instead of them. It was an option neither of us could stomach, one that would never see the light of day. "I won't, I promise," she murmured softly, her small fingers trailing along my jaw. The sparks that caressed my skin did little to ease the fear boiling within me, a feeling I was coming to loathe. "I'll always find my way back to you." I believed her, and I knew she would find me again. "You better. I'm not sure I'll be able to let you go," I breathed, giving her an empty chuckle. My wolf was fighting me at this very moment, demanding we protect our Luna at all costs, demanding we come up with some kind of plan to spare her from the vampires. "It's because you love me that you'll let me go." She smiled softly. She was right. I loved her too much to tear her away from her pack and family, I loved her too much to take away her choice. I would follow her anywhere, and knew that no matter how this war ended, we would never be apart. "In that case, you're spending the day with me." I smirked, but the expression was half-hearted. I wasn't planning on letting her out of my sight today. I couldn't afford to be as selfish as I wanted, selfish enough to whisk her away, but I could afford this. I would keep her by my side until the very last moment, until I was forced to let her go. Join our Facebook and WhatsApp group for more updates, link is given in description. Rest audiobook will be continued in next episode.